If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I have such a fun episode for you today, a jam-packed episode. I am speaking with a guest today about various screen adaptations of Agatha Christie's work. Her name is Teresa Peschel, and she wrote a book about watching over 200 English language screen adaptations of Agatha Christie. This episode is actually a great advertisement for the upcoming Agatha Christie Festival, where I have assembled a dream team of co-panelists to crown not Agatha Christie's greatest novel, because we've already done that, not Agatha Christie's greatest short story, because we already did that, but Agatha Christie's greatest screen adaptation. That is what I'm going to be discussing at this year's upcoming Agatha Christie Festival. I will be doing that with Dr. John Curran, Dr. Mark Aldridge, best-selling mystery author Victoria Dowd. All three of those people have been on the panel in the past, and this year I will be welcoming Teresa Peschel as well on that panel. So you are all going to get to know her in just a few minutes. The panel is happening on Thursday, the 12th of September of this year at 7:00 p.m. in the Spanish Barn of the Torre Abbey in Torquay on the south coast of England, where it always happens. You can go to the festival's website to book tickets. I am including a link in the notes to this episode. Tickets are actually selling out fast already. Not to alarm you, but if you have not yet bought a ticket to this event and you would like to attend, please do go to the website sooner rather than later, because I don't think they are going to last very long. And as always, you should check out all of the fabulous events that are happening, hosted by various friends of the podcast. Dr. John Curran has an event. Dr. Mark Aldridge has an event. Former panelist Dr. Jamie Berntal Hooker has what looks to be a really interesting event taking place at a local church in Torquay. And former panelist Dr. Carla Valentine also has an event. She's going to be speaking about Agatha Christie and forensics, of course. Teresa Peschel also has an event at the festival. Also, friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman, has a panel. There is a lot going on this year, so click on that link to check everything out and buy up those tickets. I hope to see you there. And as extra enticement, I am thrilled to report that I am going to be able to sell some advanced physical copies of my book. Yes, my debut mystery novel, The Busybody, does not come out in paperback in the UK officially until December of this year, but there will be advanced copies available for purchase and signing at the festival in September. So I'm just really looking forward to all of that. I'm always looking forward to the Agatha Christie Festival, but this year I'm particularly looking forward to it. I am also looking forward to my ongoing book tour in the Northeast and Midwest here in the United States. That's coming up in the month of April. I will be touring from the 9th through the 20th of April. I will be in New York, both the city and Long Island. I'll be in 2 different locations in Connecticut. I will be outside of Boston in the great state of Massachusetts. I will be in Portland, Maine. I am going to 2 separate Michigan locations and 1 location in Ohio. And I just want to highlight one of those Michigan dates. On Thursday, April 18th, I will be appearing at Schuler Books in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I am going to be doing a live episode of the All About Agatha podcast. I will be interviewed by one of the wonderful booksellers at Schuler Books. So rather than interviewing myself for this podcast, which is something that I did contemplate, believe it or not, I am going to have another human interview me, and I will be able to broadcast that to all of you. But I tell you this as enticement because it's a really great space where we'll be doing the live episode. We've got a really cool studio space in the bookstore, and I'd love to see as many of you there as possible. But that really goes for all of these events. So I'm including a link to my website with more information about all of these tour dates. Please do come and say hello and make a connection in person. It would really mean a lot to me. It's been such a joy to meet some of you out there already, and I can't wait to do more of it. And should you not be able to attend any of these events, maybe they're too far away or you just don't have the time, I totally get it. I, of course, encourage you to buy my book anyway. I've got some easy purchase links in the show notes for the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and New Zealand. And you could always shoot me an email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com and let me know what you thought after you finished it. Many of you have done that as well. And I love hearing from each and every one of you. And thank you so much for your continued support. It has made this author very, very happy. All right, back to the world of podcasting. So for today's episode, I am partially just engaging in a simple interview of Teresa Peschel, but as you'll soon see, we engaged in a ranking exercise that I think you're going to really enjoy. And I just wanted to acknowledge that the idea or the format of this ranking exercise came from one of you, from one of my most very loyal listeners. So I point that out to give him credit. He knows who he is. And to encourage all of you to get in touch with me whenever you have any ideas, because I am always listening and more than willing to incorporate those ideas into the podcast. I also should mention that the conversation Teresa and I have is very spoiler heavy. Even for this podcast, which is a spoiler-heavy podcast. Teresa and I covered a lot of different Christie stories, and we were fast and loose with our descriptions of what happens, both on the page and on the screen. So if you are worried about spoilers, this is not the episode for you. And rather than punctuate our conversation with individual spoiler warnings, as I usually do, I am going to just give you a heads up here and now as to the specific titles spoiled over the course of this 2-hour-long conversation Teresa and I had. So here goes. This is roughly in chronological order of spoilage. Major elements of the following novels will be revealed. They do it with mirrors. Death on the Nile. That one gets spoiled twice, actually. The title's so nice, it's spoiled twice. Nemesis, which is also a title so nice, it gets spoiled twice. A Murder is Announced. A Pocket Full of Rye. 5 Little Pigs. The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. Murder is Easy. Endless Night. And finally, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So you have been forewarned, listeners. All of those titles will be spoiled in the course of this conversation. If you have not read one of those books and you are really worried about being spoiled, then perhaps you should do a little bit of reading before you continue to listen to this episode. And with that, let's bring on my guest. I first heard about Teresa Peschel and her husband, Bill Peschel, by way of Tony Medawer, who has been a friend to this podcast for many years now. Tony told me that I had to talk with Teresa, who had recently come out with the book that I teased at the end of my last episode. When I did, I actually mispronounced Teresa's name. I said Peschel, but she just told me the correct pronunciation. And as I just mentioned to her before we started recording, everyone on the podcast is very familiar with my terrible mispronunciations of proper nouns. So Teresa Peschel recently wrote this wonderful book called Agatha Christie, She Watched, One Woman's Quest to Watch Every Agatha Christie Movie Without Plotting to Kill the Director, Screenwriter, Cast, Critics, or her husband. That is a book title I can definitely get behind. Not only did Teresa write this book, she and her husband Bill published it by way of Peschel Press, which they founded together in 2010 in Hershey, Pennsylvania, here in the United States. As longtime mystery readers themselves, they are dedicated to publishing the history behind the mystery, to telling the whole story and providing a deeper, richer reading experience, whether that be in fiction or nonfiction. And aside from Teresa's book, which is, of course, nonfiction, and many other offerings via Peschel Press, they have also published these annotated editions of Christie's first 6 novels thus far, from The Mysterious Affair at Styles through The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Now, these novels are only available in the United States because it is the expiration of the U.S. copyright of these works that makes these projects available. So those are available in the U.S. via Peschel Press. And interestingly, as each year passes, a new Christie work does come out of copyright here in the U.S. This isn't something we've talked about all that much on the podcast. And since Christie published approximately a book a year, I'm interested to see if they plan to continue with these annotated editions. But before I start asking all sorts of questions, I should say hello, Teresa, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kemper. I'm so pleased to be here. It's a thrill to talk about Agatha Christie, and I can talk just as long as you want, if not longer.
I'm going to take that not as a threat, but a promise, because I think we probably could give each other a run for our respective money in terms of how long we could talk about Christie. But I believe you. After reading this book, I do believe you. So
it was great fun to do. It was really great fun. It was an education. The annotating of her first 6 novels was an education, and then the films were another education all by themselves and incredibly varied, not just in films, but in the books themselves.
Yeah, so the Agatha Christie She Watched books sort of came out of these annotated editions that you were doing for Christie. Is that right? Could you just tell our listeners how you came to write this book, which is a rather encyclopedic sort of recounting of your experience watching 201 Agatha Christie adaptations?
And we're still watching them because we're watching the international films. But anyway, yes, back in July of the pandemic in 2020, the world was opening up, and I was down there at the library and I saw Crooked House on the DVD rack. I didn't even know it had been a film, and it was only the second Christie film, the second Agatha film we had ever seen. I brought it home, we watched it, we enjoyed it, and I wrote a review for the website, which always needed material. And then at about that same time period, Bill was annotating The Secret of Chimneys, which is a romantic high adventure. And I thought, is there a film? And so I went back, I discovered that there was a film involving Miss Marple, and being intimately familiar with The Secret of Chimneys, I knew Miss Marple was nowhere to be seen. But we got the set of DVDs from the library and we watched it, and the film was terrible. I wrote a review for the website, and Bill wrote his own review for the annotated Secret of Chimneys. And there were other ITV Marples on that episode. So we watched them. We had it. So we watched them, and I wrote the reviews, and Bill published them on the website. And then he said those fateful words, we could keep doing this. We've watched the films. You write a review and I'll publish it as a book. And we had no idea how big this project would be. It took us almost 3 years. We had no idea how many films there were, how far back they went, that you can go back to the very earliest film that exists, which is The Secret Adversary, is a German silent film. Mm-hmm. And Jane Bess set the mold for all future Agatha Christie adaptations because she changed names, she changed plot scenarios, she rewrote the characters, she did whatever she wanted, she threw Agatha's text to the winds, and you can assume that pretty much every scriptwriter since then has followed Jane Bess's footsteps.
Well, I love that you...
Except for the Poirots. Well, but even them, oh my God, sometimes with the Poirots, they really did some serious rewriting.
Absolutely. I love that you just sort of dipped your toe in via, the Secret of Chimneys, the fact that you owe this project in some way, at least, to the Secret of Chimneys. And I suppose Crooked House amuses me since I famously can't stand the Secret of Chimneys, but recently reread it. It is thus far the only novel that I've reread and reconsidered for the podcast because so many people have come out in its defense. And I did rank it a little bit higher in this sort of overarching ranking project that we have for the podcast that my friend Catherine Brobeck and I did. And, I can't say that I like it, but I have a little bit more regard for it, having reread it again.
Well, it is actually a romance. It is not a mystery. And if you're very familiar with the tropes in Romancelandia, which I am, I write romance as Odessa Moon. I write science fiction romance, but I want to be very clear. It is not part of the I Was the Alien's love slave subgenre. Don't look it up. You'll have to bleach your computer. And Secret of Chimneys is romantic high adventure. Every single trope that you see in a modern romance, Agatha Christie had. And the other thing to remember when you look at something like Secret of Chimneys or the Seven Dials mystery, which also doesn't get any love, is she didn't write in a vacuum. And I didn't really understand this when we started the project, but she was very well read. And so you read something like the Seven Dials mystery, and the film was funny. You're really kind of seeing this weird mix of P.G. Wodehouse with, his bright young things racing about in their motor cars, and a period thriller kind of like jammed together. She was writing mashups back in the 1920s.
Absolutely.
The Man in the Brown Suit is a great example of it because there's this wonderful scene where our heroine, Anne Bedingfield, she's on the cruise ship, and our romantic lead breaks into her cabin in the middle of the night, and she has to take his shirt off and tend to his wounds. Now, Agatha didn't go into a lot of detail, but everyone who read that knew she had to take his shirt off in order to tend to his wounds. And you will see this in thousands upon thousands of romances. But she did it in 1924?
Yeah.
Somewhere around 1924.
Well, when I reread Secret of Chimneys, I had a listener who said that you really have to read The Prisoner of Zenda before you read The Secret of Chimneys, because that is the book that she's really riffing off of, which is one of those high romance. It's written at some point in the 1890s. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
I have read The Secret of Prisoner of Zenda.
Prisoner of Zenda.
A long time ago. I've seen both of the films, and yeah, it is. And in fact, it is a Ruritanian romance. That's probably the best phrase for it, a Ruritanian romance. And I think when you annotated it, it's been a while, you even wrote a couple of essays about Ruritanian romances in The Prisoner of Zenda, did you not?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yes.
That's Bill, by the way, who's off camera there.
Far off the mic.
Off mic. Yeah. Off the Zoom camera that's not even on right now as we record audio only here for the podcast. That's really fascinating. Because, as listeners know, I will never pass up an opportunity to engage in a ranking exercise. In reading your book, reading Agatha Christie, She Watched, it was clear to me that you have thought very deeply about all these screen adaptations of Christie's. So I wanted to play a little ranking game with you where we each identify our best and worst screen adaptations for different series or programs, as they say in the UK, featuring certain actors playing either Monsieur Poirot or Miss Marple. So we are going to do this with 6 different actors. We are going to talk about our best and worst, our personal best and worst, when it comes to the Margaret Rutherfords, the Peter Ustinovs, the Joan Hicksons, the David Suchets, the Geraldine McEwens, and the Julia Mackenzies. And I think those names will mean a lot to most people out there who are listening, because these are all people who have played either Miss Marple or Monsieur Poirot in multiple adaptations. But I will do a little, I'll give a little kind of introductory information as we're going through each, just to situate everyone here and provide a little bit of context. So we are going to start with Margaret Rutherford. I'm going roughly in chronological order here. She was the first actor to play Miss Marple in any sort of a systematic way. There are only 4 Margaret Rutherford Miss Marple films, all of which she did for MGM. They they remain controversial to this day. Some people love them. Some people hate them. I actually fall somewhere in between. I neither love nor hate them. But let's run down what we're talking about here. So they are Murder, She Said from 1961, Murder at the Gallup from 1963, Murder Most Foul, which came out in the beginning of 1964, and then Murder Ahoy, which first came out toward the end of 1964.
Well, don't forget, she also cameoed in The Alphabet Murder. She was the single best minute in that terrible film.
Sure. So I'm just going to start with my favorite, which isn't hard. For me, it's Murder, She Said, which is the first one. Unlike the other three adaptations, this is based on an actual Miss Marple novel. This is based on 450 from Paddington. And it's fairly faithful. Not that being fairly faithful is a requirement for me. I mean, I actually love when adaptations go wild as long as they're doing it in an interesting or otherwise defensible way. But I think that some of the ways in which the Margaret Rutherfords go rogue as we move along with these adaptations, I'm not entirely on board with those. The other reason, let's be honest, the main reason that I'm choosing Murder, She Said is that it also features Joan Hickson. Speaking of people playing minor roles, Joan Hickson plays a minor role in Murder, She Said, and I'm always happy to see Joan Hickson, especially in a Miss Marple movie. What is your favorite Margaret Rutherford, Teresa?
I like Murder Most Foul. I think it had the best, most comprehensive script. Now, I know that this is supposed to be a Poirot property. It is Mrs. McGinty's dead, but it worked. It worked from start to finish. I love the movie within a movie, in this case, the play with the Cosgood players. There's Francesca Annis, who played Tuppence in all of the Tommy and Tuppence and Partners in Crime. There's Francesca Annis as one of the characters, the landlady with her multiple cats who she finds more loving and friendly than any of the actors she houses in her boarding house. I love the relationship that Margaret Rutherford has with Mr. Stringer, who is her real life husband. I really, really enjoyed that one. It covered everything. Now, I'll tell you one thing that you probably don't know about Murder, She Said. And you have to watch all the films in order to recognize this. So that's the 450 from Paddington, even though we retitled it. And you see that it has Margaret as Miss Marple, and Miss Marple has her faithful companion, Mr. Stringer. A French director remade the 450 from Paddington, and he put in his Tommy and Tuppence. And I believe the reason why he did is because he was not making the 450 from Paddington like Joan Hickson. He was remaking the Margaret Rutherford one. And when you see the two of them, one after the other, you will see exactly what I mean. His Tommy and Tuppence have the same kind of byplay and banter that you see with Margaret Rutherford and Mr. Stringer.
Oh, that's so interesting. What year was that French film made?
2008, Crime is Our Business.
Gotcha.
Apparently, and I'm indebted to Dr. Mark Aldrich for this, the Margaret Rutherfords were shown in repeat constantly in Europe. And apparently everybody in Germany, and I guess France too, when they think of Miss Marple, they think of Margaret Rutherford because they saw it so many times over and over and over. And, you know, she's so distinctive. Champion checkers player, champion equestrian, champion fencer, champion rifle shooting, champion with pistols, champion chemist. I mean, she is truly a remarkably well-rounded woman in so many different ways. When the opening music comes on, that sprightly harpsichord jazzy theme, you just know you have moved into a different world.
Totally. I mean, I love the Margaret Rutherford adaptations for themselves. What she's doing is something that she does really well in those films and playing off of her husband. And they're so charming. And we know that Agatha Christie even had a lot of affection for Margaret Rutherford herself, even if she had issues with her portrayal of Miss Marple. It's just something different. And it's not surprising to me that she was super popular in Europe. I mean, you know, it's a little bit of like the Jerry Lewis phenomenon, like that kind of tracks.
Exactly.
That makes sense to me. So, yeah, I mean, and that's why actually, so moving now to our least favorite of the Margaret Rutherfords, you'd think that Murder Ahoy might be my least favorite, but there's something just so bonkers about that one where, you know, they completely just decided, Murder Ahoy never actually gets credit for the fact that it is very partially based on a piece of a Miss Marple novel, there is an element of Murder Ahoy that is taken from They Do It With Mirrors, actually, which is like this boys' school. It's on a ship in Murder Ahoy because Murder Ahoy takes place on a ship, but that is something that actually is within They Do It With Mirrors. Otherwise, though, this is just an invention of MGM and the Margaret Rutherford machine. But I kind of, I think there's a madcap joyousness to it and almost an honesty at that point where they're like, yeah, we're just going to be untethered and do what we want here. So I actually don't hate Murder Ahoy. I'm sad to say that actually it was a toss up for me between the other two, between Murder at the Gallop or Murder Most Foul, as to which my least favorite would be. But I chose Murder Most Foul, your favorite, only because I'm such a mega fan of Mrs. McGinty's Dead now, actually. And it's surprising to me that now that I've kind of gone through the entire oeuvre and I have some distance from it. Mrs. McGinty's Dead is one of those unsung titles that has really just lasted for me. And I don't totally love what is being done with it. It just, to me, I would have rathered if that too was just a bit more, let's just make up a new Miss Marple story. Again, I don't necessarily mind when adaptations aren't faithful, but there's some warping and twisting of that one, which as a Mrs. McGinty's Dead, as an opportunity to adapt that novel, kind of irks me. But as I think you can probably tell, I actually really don't hate any of these Margaret Rutherford films. I love that they exist, and I'm always happy to rewatch them when they're on.
Well, my least favorite of the Margaret Rutherfords, unless you include the alphabet murders, which, while it looked fabulous, was absolutely terrible, and she was the best single minute in that film, is Murder Ahoy. There were just too many places where the plot didn't work for me. That film was becalmed. First off, they're filming it on the ship, and I always like seeing a ship or a boat in a film. I was in the Navy, and there were things about that film, particularly when you find the body of, I think it's one of the sub-lieutenants, hanging from the yard arm. This is a ship. This is supposed to be a Navy training vessel to bring up young delinquents. Where was their watchstander? No one was standing watch. You are always going to have someone standing watch, even when you are in a harbor at anchor.
Why are you expecting this movie to make sense, though?
Yes, I was expecting to get the Navy details right, at least sort of right, especially because they were filming on board. I have to check my notes here. They were filming on board the training ship Arethusa, which was built in 1911. She was in service with the Royal Navy, and then she was actually repurposed as a home for wayward boys. They didn't make that up.
Wow, that's great.
They did not make that up. But there were so many things that, there were things that they really did well in there, because when Margaret moves on board, because of course she has and I'm going to get the vocabulary wrong here, but she is of course reasonably well placed in the Naval Reserve, and she outranks the captain, and so everyone has to move down until the second sub-lieutenant gets a hammock in the hold, and that's exactly what would happen. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what would happen. So there she is on board the ship. They're doing some things right, and then they're doing other things just wrong. Watching Chief Inspector Craddock, he's down there with his constable, and they're trapped in the hold. Holds are really big. They're really big. He could have found another hatch. And again, where were all of the boys? What I liked about it was this is the only adaptation of They Do It With Mirrors, and I've now seen 5, because there's a French one, that considered how Louis Serracold was using his juvenile delinquents as part of a fraud and embezzlement scheme. This is the only one that covered that. The other 4 did not.
Yeah, which is very dark.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. And seeing the young JDs in their Cracker Jack uniforms marching off. I mean, there was so much to like about that, but the plot just didn't. There were just too many holes in the plot.
The one thing I also want to mention, this is now like podcast crosstalk, and you mentioned Dr. Mark Aldrich, who is, sort of the guiding light of this discussion, since he is one of the foremost experts. And obviously we're drawing on his book, Agatha Christie on Screen, and his Hercule Poirot book, and he has this Miss Marple book that's coming out, and he's doing this great podcast. And
Swinging Christie's.
Yeah, exactly. And in a recent episode, he and his co-host, Gray, were talking about Murder Ahoy, and they mentioned that, and I forget now which Miss Marple text it is, but there is a Miss Marple text where Agatha Christie's Miss Marple references the fact that she has a relative in the Navy. So there's actually a scintilla of textual support for Murder Ahoy. Yeah, and I just always found that juvenile delinquent aspect of They Do It With Mirrors to be the most interesting thing about that book. It's one of the very few Christies where the mystery is actually perhaps a little too simple and a little too easy to solve. There are a number of people that I've spoken to, Christie fans who said, yeah, that one I actually figured out.
Oh, yeah, because when you think about it, they're the only two people who were not in the room. And if they are the only two people who were not in the room while the murder takes place, well, perhaps they were involved.
That is, I think, a good review and roundup of the Margaret Rutherford films. Let's move on to our next actor that we have to consider here. One of my very favorite actors when it comes to Christie adaptations, that would be Peter Ustinov, who played our beloved Monsieur Poirot in 6 different films/television episodes. We're just going to list all 6 of them now in chronological order. So we've got Death on the Nile in 1978, Evil Under the Sun in 1982, 13 at Dinner in 1985. That is the American title of what is more popularly known as Lord Edgware Dies. That's its UK title. Dead Man's Folly in 1986. Murder in 3 Acts, also in 1986. That is the American title of 3-Act Tragedy. And finally, Appointment with Death in 1988. Well, I started off on my favorite for Margaret Rutherford, so why don't you start off on your favorite Peter Ustinov, Teresa?
It's really hard to choose between Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun.
Same.
They are both absolutely outstanding, but we'll go with Death on the Nile because of the 3 versions that I've seen. It is still the best by far. I just love Angela Lansbury as Salome Otterborn.
My world is the world of grand love and passion and romance, not grubby murders. Now, if you'll please leave me alone.
Well, if we have disturbed you, we are both desolate.
Oh, life can be so cruel. One must be brave, very brave, to bear the calumnies of life. Here, barman. This crocodile has lost its croc.
They covered most of the text, and I loved seeing David Niven show up as Colonel Race. He knows exactly what to do with a cobra as he whips out his sword cane and beheads the cobra. Although how you got the cobra on the ship in the first place is a good question. And they handled the ship really well, too, because they were filming on board the Sudan. They were filming on board the SS Sudan, so they are actually on a ship. And that makes a difference in how the camera can move around. That's one of the major flaws for me with the Sir Kenny's Death on the Nile. Mm-hmm. They did not film that on board a ship.
And you can tell.
You can tell.
Yeah.
You can tell. They're not on board a real ship. The only real ships that you see in that film, and God, they did something else that was stunningly stupid. I've never seen this before, and I cannot understand this. The crew left the ship at night. They let the passengers run amok on the ship, including apparently on the bridge, in the engine room, in the galley where they had live steam. Whatever else killed that movie for me, that was the finishing blow. But anyway, they didn't make any of these mistakes with Peter Ustinov's Death on the Nile. It was just superb. Absolutely loved it. I can't recommend it highly enough. And it and Evil Under the Sun are just so fun.
Yeah, they are. I had the exact same dilemma. I had to choose between Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun. And it really is hard because, especially when it comes to campiness, I would say Evil Under the Sun edges out. Despite the hijinks between Maggie Smith and Bette Davis in Death on the Nile, we have more Maggie Smith, even better, more heightened Maggie Smith hijinks between her and Diana Rigg in Evil Under the Sun. And it's just
wonderful.
So delicious. But I also chose Death on the Nile. I don't think it's really to be argued that that's the best one. Ultimately, it's the first one. And I've talked so often on this podcast about my high regard for that adaptation, and particularly the way that it handles the denouement, where they take their time. And Peter Ustinov goes through each and every suspect and how they could possibly have done it. And then we flash back to possible scenarios in which, maybe it happened this way. And then it's such a complicated solution, but they really air every little piece of what Christie does on the page, or almost every little piece of what Christie does on the page. And we get a full and complete and satisfying rendition of that complicated solution that she has to that puzzle mystery. And I love that they take their time and they do that. And we do not get that. We certainly don't get that in the Kenneth Branagh version. And we don't even get it as much in the Suchet. And now I could be making this up, and I'm sure you will be able to tell me whether or not this is true. But I remember, I think that the Suchet version, they actually also filmed it on the same boat that was used.
No, they did not.
They did not?
No, they did not. They filmed, I have to look it up. Let's see. Death on the Nile with Peter Ustinov was filmed. I believe that it was the paddle ship Memnon, whereas David Suchet filmed on the SS Sudan. That's the steamship Sudan, which even has its very own Agatha Christie suite. So they both filmed them on boats.
So they're both on boats, but they weren't the same boat. For some reason, I had in my head that they were the same boat.
No, They were not the same boat. They were. One was a steamship, one was a paddle ship. They are different. Only a ship engineer can tell you the difference.
The Suchet is actually a fine adaptation. I certainly prefer it to the Branagh, but
it was definitely better than the Kenneth Branagh. Yeah. But one of the things that they did that I just couldn't accept is we have this opening scene with Simon and Jackie, and they're in their garret apartment, and he's with his hot girlfriend in bed, and apparently he can't perform. He couldn't get it up. I couldn't accept that. I just couldn't. And if they wanted to show us their poverty, what you're seeing here is an obvious choice by the director to show naked skin on the screen instead of showing poverty the way it actually would have been, where they would be sitting shivering on park benches eating fish and chips out of newspaper cones. But you watch that scene, and what you see, and you just can't accept that Simon Doyle couldn't get it up because he was worried about poverty. He was like 25. It just doesn't happen.
It's a little bit of a ham-fisted attempt, I think, to be quote unquote sexy. And it's funny. I remember contrasting that with the fact that because the tone of the Suchet series changed so much over time. I've also talked about this so many times on the podcast, but I'm a much bigger fan of the early episodes that had a lot of lightness to them and had the quote unquote family of Poirot and Hastings and Japp and Miss Lemon. And then we lose that, and we get a much crabbier, more angsty, more lonely Poirot when we get
a well-dressed ball of rage.
Yeah, when we get those auteur-driven kind of more filmic adaptations in the later episodes. And it's just funny that what they're doing in their Death on the Nile is trying to sex it up, and not very well, because you're right, it's just odd, versus something like Triangle at Rhodes, which was one of their earlier adaptations, which is actually a bit sexy on the page, and the adaptation is slightly more buttoned up, which I thought was really amusing. But there's a charm to that, and we lose, I think, some of that charm in these later adaptations, but better than the Branagh. And I actually liked the Jackie Poirot relationship in the Suchet, even though it still doesn't capture what Christie did on the page, which is one of the best things about Death on the Nile. That probably comes closest to capturing it, even though it doesn't, since what Mia Farrow is doing is very different from who Jacqueline is in the book. But I don't mind that because it's Mia Farrow and she's fabulous, and she pulls it off.
And what I really liked about both the Ustinov and the Suchet Poirots is they made Lynette Ridgway the girl boss that she is in the text, because she's not necessarily a pleasant woman. And it's her way or the highway. They took their time setting up Lynette Ridgway. Even when she's driving into the village and you see village yokels discussing how rich she is and all the changes that she's going to make, and she wants what she wants. And Sir Kenny, because he was hiring Gal Gadot as his Lynette Ridgway, he didn't make her into the character she is in the novel, which is not really a very pleasant person. And what makes the tragedy of Death on the Nile, I think, even larger in the film, what makes the tragedy even more tragic is that Jackie was not just her best friend, but her only true friend, who wasn't a friend because of what Lynette Ridgway could do for her. And she saw Simon Doyle and wanted him, even though she could afford to have pretty much anyone else.
Yeah. What Christie does there with aligning our sympathies with the murderer, and I know, yes, there are two murderers, but let's be honest, Jacqueline is the one who's leading the train there, or the boat, as it were.
She planned it all because she knew Simon would mess it up. He would do something dopey, and he would immediately be caught and hung by the crown, and then she wouldn't have him. So as soon as she figured out what he wanted to do, she said, "This is what we're going to do."
Right. So the way that she, I think, makes her sympathies align with the murderer and really not with the victim. I finished that book and I really loathe Lynette and I kind of love Jack, or at least I understand her. She often does that in her books, but that's probably one of the best examples of it. And yeah, well, I am not surprised that we both picked Death on the Nile. So I will go first then for my least favorite of the Ustinovs. My favorite was the first Ustinov, and my least favorite is the last Ustinov, which is Appointment with Death.
I had the same thing.
Really? That's so funny. Look at that.
Because it wasn't them going back in time. I actually thought that 13 at Dinner was really quite well done, and they handled the leap forward in time, I thought, really well. Appointment with Death, oh my God, it was an appointment with tedium. And the going back in time was fine. Movies do what they do, but they made Poirot a fool. They made him, having doors slam into him. And one of the things that I seem to remember from learning along the way is that when Rosalind was discussing remaking David Suchet as Poirot, and maybe that was the example she had in her mind, don't make fun of Poirot. Don't make him out to be an idiot. And they did that in Appointment with Death. I mean, there are things to like about that. Lauren Bacall was absolutely fabulous. They handled Mrs. Boynton fairly well. Fairly well.
Yeah.
Certainly better than in the Suchet version. You got a lot of the story in there, although I don't think it was. They made Mrs. Boynton into a TV villain of the week instead of the almost like villain in the novel. I really didn't like how you had this entire subplot. It's like the scriptwriter felt they didn't have enough plot to deal with. And so they added street Arabs sharing secrets with Mrs. Boynton, and that went nowhere. And they had Dr. Sarah chasing this lithe young man through a souk that he knows like the back of her hand, and she knows nothing about, and yet she's able to keep him in view all the time. And then that entire bizarre subplot where Jefferson Cope and Miss Quinton, the Haley Mills character, suddenly they disappear, and apparently they have this fabulous adventure in the desert with a troop of Arabs all riding Arabian horses, and they're gone for several days, and then they come back and it's like nothing ever happened. And that was like, what? I just couldn't figure that out. There were so many huge plot holes, absolutely bad plot holes. But the worst of it, again, was watching them make Peter Ustinov as Poirot into a fool, and he is not.
He is definitely not.
That was unacceptable.
Yeah, he's definitely not a fool. And I think, it's one of those adaptations that does have a star-studded cast. And many of these Peter Ustinovs did, right? I mean, you mentioned Lauren Bacall, Carrie Fisher, John Gielgud, Piper Laurie, and I think you also just mentioned Haley Mills. It feels flat, though, despite all of those wonderful actors in it. In that way, it actually kind of reminds me of the Angela Lansbury The Mirror Cracked, which also just has so many fabulous people in it and never just feels like it gets off the ground. And to me, it just felt like the Ustinov adaptations were a little bit on autopilot at this point. I think they were. Yeah, I didn't feel the verve from him. And he's a man who was overflowing with the verve or vim or vigor or whatever you want to call it. Put him on a talk show and blink and 3 hours have gone by and you've just been utterly charmed and delighted. And I think he brought that spirit to Poirot in especially those earlier adaptations, especially in Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun. And it's just not there. It's not there in Appointment with Death. And
no, it is not. And he does manage in Dead Man's Folly, which was better than the Suchet version. And if that comes up in the conversation, I'll tell you why. And he does that in 13 at Dinner, most definitely. And he also does it, well, he doesn't do it so much in 3-Act Tragedy. You can see him getting tired. The reason why you watch 3-Act Tragedy with Peter Ustinov is so you can watch Tony Curtis.
Yes.
That is the reason why you watch that film. Especially if you don't know the story, because there are two versions of 3-Act Tragedy. There's the English version and there's the American version. And the Ustinov 3-Act Tragedy is, of course, they filmed the American version, and the David Suchet, they filmed the English version. And his version is a better film. But you watch the Ustinov version to see Tony Curtis, who did an amazing job.
I agree. I think you can see the decline, though, of Ustinov's portrayal. It's like it starts in Murder in Three Acts, but then it flatlines in Appointment with Death.
The last one is just, it's sad to see him. He just doesn't have the sparkle anymore.
It is sad. I was predicting to myself if we were going to agree on any of these, because to me, it just feels inevitable that you would have to pick Death on the Nile as one's favorite, and then Appointment with Death as least favorite. So I'm super, super thrilled that we agreed on that one. All right, let's move on to Joan Hickson. There are enough adaptations here that I'm not going to list all of them. Suffice to say, all 12 of the Miss Marple novels were adapted within the Hickson series / program, and none of the Miss Marple short stories. So we have 12 episodes to choose from, which aired on the BBC starting in 1984 and ending in 1992. I will start with my favorite of the Joan Hicksons, and it's actually really hard for me to pick just one among these that is my favorite, because Joan Hickson is my favorite Miss Marple. I am going to go for Nemesis, actually, which is a Miss Marple novel that I've gone on record as loving a whole lot. I think it's one of Christie's late career gems. It's not perfect by any means, but my love for it is due in large part to the character work that she's doing where Miss Marple is concerned. And I think Joan Hickson really nails that aspect of the novel. But as is often the case with the Hickson series, I think that the supporting cast is also superb, especially Margaret Tyzack as Clotilde Bradbury Scott. And it's so important to have a Clotilde who is terrifying, convincingly terrifying. The climactic moment in which she confronts Miss Marple and she's in bed and she's looking so frail and weak, but that, Joan Hickson is not going to take any prisoners. Other people will be taking her away as prisoner. It's one of my favorite moments in the entire series. The only other episode I just have to give a shout out to, and this is probably the other one that I would have chosen if I didn't choose Nemesis, is A Murder is Announced. I think Ursula Howells as Charlotte Blacklock is just fantastic, and it's just a great adaptation overall. And that is our top-ranked Miss Marple novel. Murder is Announced is just a fabulous Miss Marple novel. So it really is a toss-up between those two, but I'm going to go with Nemesis.
Well, I was also leaning towards A Murder is Announced.
Mm-hmm.
A Caribbean Mystery. They did a fabulous job. But I really liked The Body in the Library. They did, I thought, a really outstanding job with that. And one of the things I liked the most about it, there's so much that you can read into Agatha Christie because she doesn't hit you upside the head with her insights. She leaves it there on the page, and you have scope in which to add or to interpret.
Sure.
And it's how she handled Ruby Keene, how this particular film handled Ruby Keene. And you can really see the class issues here, because every single thing you see on screen is Ruby Keene being a not that bright, kind of naive 18-year-old. You're even told this by some of the other characters, like Raymond Starr in particular. And when you see Ruby Keene with Conway Jefferson, you see someone who is able to relax. She is like 18 years old, and he is an old man in a wheelchair, and she doesn't have to think about him putting his hand down her dress and his tongue down her throat when she is dancing with him, which is what she has to put up with when she is on the floor dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And she can relax with him. It's almost like she's with she grew up in a theatrical family. That's what we're told, a very rackety upbringing. And then everyone, including Miss Marple, decides that she's a gold digger. But what you see on screen, she isn't. She's a kid who has this moment of safety, these moments of safety with Conway Jefferson, where it's like he's her grandfather. Mm-hmm. And to see Joan Hickson dismiss her as a gold digger is, I thought, really telling. And it shows that Miss Marple herself will make mistakes like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet at the same time, she's very concerned about, who is being murdered, about the evil that is running through the Majestic Hotel. But she still takes that view.
Yeah. And that's the first adaptation, right?
Yes, it is the first adaptation. They really took their time to do it well, so you get virtually the entire plot on screen. I really liked how Arthur Bantry was handled. You could see him starting to, and they didn't spend, they didn't hit you over the head with it, but you could see him starting to feel really uncomfortable because everyone around him is saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. So what is that blonde girl doing on your hearth rug in your library? That 18-year-old.
Yep.
And there was just so much to really like. And I did. The Joan Hicksons, as a rule, every one of them is very watchable. And in fact, we just watched, we'll get to that, but they all have something to offer. They all have, great acting. You get to see Joan Hickson, who really is, in so many ways, I think, the closest to Agatha's vision of Miss Marple.
Yeah.
And as she does in the novel, she makes the occasional mistake. Not just because she's old, but because she is of her class.
Right. In certain ways, she's a marginal person, obviously. She's on the outside looking in, but in other ways, she's really not, right? I mean, she really does belong. She has a place within St. Mary Mead and within this community. And I think,
she knows that she has a place in the world. It is a much better place than Ruby Keene.
Exactly. And I think we're even the first, I remember being struck by the first time we even see Miss Marple in The Body in the Library. We see her instructing her maid how to build a fire. And we get it's just such a great little character piece because without any exposition, we understand her firmness, her kindness, her pedantic nature. You get so much. And Joan Hickson is so good at conveying all of that through body language and through her eyes. And she just, like, from the very first scene, from the first frame, you feel like she's capturing and inhabiting the Miss Marple that we know from the page. And I think she's the only one who really does that, which is why I love these. And I agree. I think that these adaptations do tend to take their time, sometimes to their detriment. They can feel a little airless at times. They can feel a little plodding and slow. And there are occasionally production value issues, especially from our jazzified 21st century perspective, where I think sometimes we're used to everything looking very glossy and moving a little bit more quickly than would have been the case if we were watching these contemporaneously in the mid 80s and early 90s. So I just want to clarify that that's also, I'm contextualizing some of my issues with the series in that way. So that's going to be my biggest dig for my least favorite of the Joan Hicksons, and actually was easy for me to figure out which was my least favorite. So it's The Moving Finger, pretty easily my least favorite Miss Marple novel, which I know is a little controversial. There are a lot of people that like it a whole lot more than I do. This has been a point of contention on the podcast. We have it ranked pretty low, but it's not even because of the underlying text that I don't love the Joan Hickson adaptation as much as I do some of the others. There is this montage sequence, and it's an odd sequence in the book as well, when Jerry takes Megan to London to get made over.
Oh, yes. And you get those blue sepia montage of
still shots. It's like
still shots.
It's still shots that are just, we're given a series of weirdly colorized frames of her just sort of like going into different shops and having different outfits on. It's so weird, and it just feels cheap. It feels cheap and underproduced. And there are moments like that within other episodes, but that's probably the most glaring of the entire series. And just the whole adaptation, also, it's one of the ones that feels a little slow, feels a little airless and underproduced to me. So that is my least favorite of the Hicksons.
Well, what really bothered me about The Moving Finger was the actress they used to play Megan, because she was a black hole on the screen, and she needed to have this innocent allure about her, because why else would Jerry fall head over heels in love with her?
Well, it's an open question from the book, quite honestly, I think, but yes.
It's I think you get a little bit more in the book, and this is where the right casting choice can make such a difference, because, oh God, what a terrible casting choice they made here. And that's the thing that has really come through in watching hundreds of adaptations. If you choose wrongly for a critical character, Crooked House is a good example. You're watching this and thinking, why would anybody care about you? Because you're just not that interesting. You need someone who lights up the screen. And I'm looking at her name here. Oh, Deborah Appleby, and she had a very short career. I think she acted in like 3 roles, and this was one of them. And you see why. Because she just wasn't there. She just wasn't there. And then there were all kinds of holes with Dr. Griffith's plot and his sister. There were things they could have done better. So yes, I understand your choice for the moving finger, but it's not my choice.
All right, what's your choice?
Pocket Full of Rye.
Interesting.
They completely rewrote the ending. That was a terrible ending. Having Lancelot Fortescue hit by a lorry so that he didn't have to face justice. What a terrible ending. And then setting him up as though, oh, it was okay that, he murdered his father because he had had a traumatic, abused childhood. They did things right in that. Their Gladys was absolutely spot on. Their actress for Gladys.
Yes.
But I just couldn't accept how they rewrote Lance Fortescue. I could not accept how they opened with Rex Fortescue skipping along merrily down the sidewalk, down a London sidewalk to give flowers to his hot secretary, and then never using that as an explanation for Percy why he was concerned about his father going insane. And they dropped one of the major plot points. Jennifer Fortescue, she was married to Percy Fortescue, and her mother was Mrs. Mackenzie, and Mrs. Mackenzie has critical plot information. And the way the script was written, Joan Hickson says, she's almost gaga, and so there's no point in interviewing her. That would have never stopped Miss Marple. She would have gone and interviewed anyway, because when people are going gaga, you just don't know what they're going to say.
I think that's a really fair critique about Lance Fortescue, because he is one of the darkest scoundrels in the Christie oeuvre. I mean, he is among a long list of very unlikable, murderer characters she has. I think he is one of the worst. And it's one of the reasons, that's also such a, Miss Marple as avenging fury. It's one of those books where you feel her vengeance and her anger over what he did and his disrespect to Gladys, yes. and just the way, and it's like they're trying to soften those edges with those endings. And why? Why? Just let it rip.
They were. And Miss Marple's response to Gladys's murder is critical, because Gladys was one of the many, many housemaids that she got from the orphanage, that she trained into a maid so she could go off and have at least some kind of a life of her own. And she was essentially Gladys's only family, which is why Gladys was writing to her. And Lance Fortescue used her. He used her cruelly, making her think that he valued her, that he heard her, that he saw her as a human being, as a woman. You see the postcards that she sends to Miss Marple towards the end with a snapshot of Lance Fortescue. Isn't he a nice boy? Look how nice he is.
Yeah.
And she is just livid. And that's why she's there in the first place. Because Lance Fortescue murdered Gladys, not because he murdered his father or anyone else, but because he killed Gladys. And this is where Miss Marple's feelings for other people, that they matter, however, high up or low down on the food chain they matter. And turning Lance Fortescue into, I had a difficult childhood, so, it's kind of understandable why I did what I did. And so karma rescued me from my fate of meeting the hangman. No.
Right. Ms. Marple would have been like, I don't care about your childhood. You don't have to turn into a cruel person. There are other people with difficult childhoods who don't murder poor innocent girls.
Exactly.
No, I agree. And I think it's, that ending, Christie's ending with the postcard, it's so convenient. It's ridiculously convenient, but it packs such an emotional punch that I love it. And I love that she has that ending in there, because I can
quote from it. I can quote from it. The tears, she looks at the postcard and the photograph. The tears rose in Miss Marple's eyes. Succeeding pity, there came anger at a heartless killer. And then displacing both of these emotions, there came a surge of triumph. The triumph some specialist might feel who has successfully reconstructed an extinct animal from a fragment of jawbone and a couple of teeth. She knew that there was something wrong. And this is her proof. She went there, she went to Yew Trees, or whatever the name of the manor was, to get justice for Gladys. And she was able to do it. And then Gladys, after her death, provides her the final piece of proof that she needs to get justice for Gladys.
Mm-hmm. Justice from beyond the grave.
Justice from
Gladys.
beyond the
I
grave.
love it. No,
and then they screwed up the ending by having a lorry driver kill him. So he never has to suffer. Lance Fortescue goes to his death without ever having to feel one single twinge of guilt.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's a rare misstep in that series. Not that they didn't, there are other slight departures that they made, but usually you could tell that whoever was adapting those novels, that they got it. They got what the message of the story was and sort of the underlying themes and what it meant and who Miss Marple was. But I agree with you. That is a rare misstep. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, well, that is the Joan Hickson series. Let's move right along to the much beloved David Suchet series, Agatha Christie's Poirot. So Suchet famously adapted every Poirot story Christie wrote, except for the Le Mesurier Inheritance and her original Poirot play, Black Coffee. That is 70 episodes of Poirot, which aired from 1989 through 2013, nearly a quarter century of David Suchet as Poirot. And similar to the Hickson series, I find it relatively easy to identify my least favorite episode and rather difficult to identify my favorite, since I love so many of them. But Teresa, why don't you go first? What is your favorite Suchet as Poirot episode?
Five Little Pigs. It was exquisite. Every part of it. I loved the way that they had the two different scenes, just the way the filming was done. So the modern era was almost shot in a harsh light. When you were looking at the memories of Lucy Crail, they're sepia toned. And if you go further back in time, when it's Amyas and Caroline and Philip and Meredith, the film stock changes again. So it's like the memories become more wispy, more faded. I love the way that they actually amped up the ending with Lucy Crail holding a gun on Elsa Greer. And then in a callback to that scene where she's playing Cowboys and Indians with Angela, she refuses. You see Elsa Greer is so filled with anger about her own choices, so much self-loathing, and yet she will not commit suicide herself, but she wants someone else to shoot her. She would be delighted to have Lucy Crail shoot her because then again, it takes her own guilt out of her hands. Everything about that was just perfect. It was just absolutely perfect. I can't say enough about it. And there were other great episodes. Sad Cypress was fabulous. The Chocolate Box, an exquisite episode, but Five Little Pigs was perfect.
Oh, the Chocolate Box was one of my honorable mentions as well. I love that episode. Absolutely love that one. I love the Five Little Pigs adaptation. I think that one of my favorite things about Five Little Pigs, which is our top ranked Agatha Christie novel. So I'll sing the praises of Five Little Pigs forever. I love the fact that that this is all in retrospect, right? It's murder in retrospect, and we're given all of these impressions of the past, but we never actually go back to the past in the novel. So, Caroline and Amyas, and even all these people who we are meeting in the present day, all of their interactions and who they are, but especially Caroline and Amyas, we never actually meet them. We never actually see them. And the way that Christie is then painting this filtered picture of them and doing it as masterfully as she does. It's one of my favorite things. And we just lose that. We necessarily lose that aspect of the novel when it is adapted. I think that this adaptation, by shooting it differently, does about as good of a job as you possibly can. But I think for that reason, I'm just wondering now, since you chose Five Little Pigs, why I didn't choose Five Little Pigs. And I think that's why. Although I will also shout out one rare significant departure that they make in this adaptation, which I loved. And that was Philip Blake actually being in love with Amyas, as played by Toby Stephens. And that is one of those, it's rang true to me for the character, because in the book, he's got this weird, tortured kind of relationship with Caroline, and it seems that he doesn't like her, but then apparently he really did, and he was in love with her. And I don't think that Christie was hinting at a homosexual attraction between Philip and Amyas, but I think that there was, like, as you were saying, when there's room, there's room in these stories for interpretation.
For that, yes, there was room for that interpretation.
100%.
And I did not have a problem with that interpretation at all, because you have to have a reason for that intense emotional response.
Yes.
And particularly when you consider that Philip never marries, Meredith never marries either. And Meredith is the heir. And if Meredith doesn't marry and produce a male heir, then that name and that title and that estate, assuming that they're entailed, will go to someone else. Some third cousin or the crown will get it. And there's an immense pressure on anyone in the peerage to marry and produce an heir, because you have to keep the title going.
Right.
And the different filming techniques I thought really worked, because novels are not films and films are not novels. And what you can do in a book, you cannot do on film, and vice versa.
Fair. I mean, it's, the answer to my issue is then I guess you can never adapt Five Little Pigs, which, maybe it's just such a good book. You just can't.
Well, I've seen 3 adaptations of it now. There are actually 3 film adaptations. No, 4. There are 4. That's right. There are 4. There are actually 4 adaptations. And the one thing that they didn't do in this one, which really surprised me, because I know for a fact that the Poirot series has at least one staff artist, because when they did 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, they did a very fine, the studio artist did a very fine copy of a homage, let's say, of a Tamara Lempicka picture to hang in someone's office. And you never see Amyas Creel's masterpiece. And the masterpiece is, I think, a critical piece of evidence for Poirot, because, as he says, it is the portrait of a young woman watching her lover die.
Mm-hmm.
And in the other 3 films, a French one, a Chinese one, and an Indian one, you see the painting. And that can go either way, because if you can't get a good painting like the Chinese painting, it's very clear that he should have stuck to landscapes. The French one, the painting, it's, again, you have to see a painting. You can't look at it on screen. You can't look at it on screen, because paintings in the real world are not the same as paintings in a book. It just isn't. That's the only thing I wanted. I wanted to see the painting. We never see any part of the painting, and I know that they had staff artists who could have done something.
Right.
Even if you just see a corner of it.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think because of that, because it's so different seeing a painting on screen versus standing in front of a painting. I mean, the way that she describes the painting, and so that we created ourselves in our mind's eye, that obviously works. I think it would be really tricky to pull that off. I would worry about that. So I think it's a defensible position not to show the painting, actually, because it can go so wrong.
Having seen the Chinese version, you can see how wrong it can go. The French one was pretty good. The Indian one, not so good, but still better than the Chinese.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I can't wait to read about all these other adaptations in your follow-up book, right? About all of these non-English language adaptations of Agatha Christie.
Oh, absolutely. We are including every non-English language film that we can find that has English subtitles. And unfortunately, and maybe someone in your audience can provide this for us, unfortunately, some of the best adaptations, the Japanese ones, the Russians are surprisingly accurate to the text, but you can find them on Daily Motion, you can find them on YouTube, but they don't have English subtitles, and I don't speak Japanese. There are some really great ones. What we're watching right now is the Korean drama Ms. Ma, Nemesis, which is one of the very few adaptations of a Miss Marple novel. Almost always they do the Poirot's. We hope to have the book finished by August, you think? Probably by August. We hope to have it in hand by September, but we'll find out because we still have to do Ms. Ma. We have to rewatch Checkmate. We've got Murder is Easy, and then it takes a lot of time to get everything laid out and so forth.
Well, I covered Ms. Ma Nemesis for the podcast Patreon page, actually. So I watched all of those episodes. And I mean, not just adapting one Miss Marple novel, it's adapting multiple Miss Marple novels all in one show. I think that show is actually one of the more brilliant adaptations of Miss Marple, and what they end up doing and where that story ends up going vis-a-vis what Christie is doing.
This time. No
I'm not. I cannot praise Ms. Ma enough. I love that show. So
we are loving it. We have watched the first 8 episodes. So we just finished the section with the moving finger.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks to me like we are going to head into The Mirror Cracked. I'm guessing. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, interestingly, the Chinese, when they did Checkmate, they also took a number of novels and several short stories and aspects of novels and then wove it all together in one great big overall arc. But the subtitling was maddening. And we have to rewatch the entire Checkmate series in order to figure out how well it ties together. But Ms. Ma is tying together much better.
Yeah, it's great.
You haven't seen Checkmate yet?
I haven't seen that, no. But yeah, Ms. Ma is absolutely brilliant. Okay, well, let's get back to David Suchet and Poirot here. So for my favorite, I mean, I was really, really tempted to name one of the early episodes adapting the short stories, the 50-minute episodes, which are definitely among my most cherished episodes. Catherine and I talked at length about how we prefer that lighter tone. I even mentioned it earlier in this episode, to the darker episodes that came later. And those were mainly adaptations of novels in those later seasons/series. I actually find that one of the more memorable adaptations, so this is what I'm going to choose, is the 2-part adaptation of Peril at End House, which opens up the second season of the show. Peril at End House is one of my favorite Poirot novels. It was Catherine Brobeck's perhaps favorite Christie novel overall. We didn't rank it number 1, but when we're talking about favorites, that's a different sort of a thing from what might be the quote unquote best novel. So this is also a little bit of a Catherine shout out here. But I think that this adaptation did all of the darkness and the angst that lies at the heart of that book justice, but then not at the expense of the lightness that I love from those earlier episodes as well. It's just a really nimble adaptation of a novel. And it's in fact the first adaptation of a novel in the series overall. The 3rd season opened up with The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which is also one of my favorite novel adaptations in the Suchet series. If I were going to pick one of the early short story adaptations, it would probably have to be Problem at Sea, which is one of Christie's more outlandish stories on the page. And the adaptation really does not disappoint. That's the one where Poirot gets up close and personal with a doll, with the ventriloquist doll. It's insane in the best of ways.
It's a doll.
Yes, a doll. Except this doll is an important witness to the truth of who killed Madame Clapperton. But how is it this doll can tell us what it knows, huh? But this is a doll that can speak.
I like Problem at Sea a lot. And they filmed that, by the way, on a real ship. That is the motor yacht Madiz, which was built in 1902 and is still in service. And it was period appropriate because it would have been in service in the Mediterranean at that time, having built in 1902. And yes, it is. She is still in service today.
Wow. Yeah. It's not that big. I remember it looking not all that large.
She's not. Yeah. She's not. The monster cruise ships and yachts that you see today are not what you would have seen 100 years ago. You just would not have built a ship that large. Like in the Peter Ustinov Evil Under the Sun, when you see Horace Blatt's yacht, that actually is the size of a yacht that you would have had, because how else can you go in and sail in and around all of those little islands in the Mediterranean and make a port of call? You can't do that in a 300-foot yacht.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk about our least favorite of the Suchet series. What is your least favorite, Teresa?
Oh, I was going to say something about Peril at End House, which is that there were vital clues that they just totally glided by. We had to stop the DVD and go frame by frame. They did handle a lot of it very well, but if you didn't, my feeling on that was if you weren't very familiar with the story, it didn't work. Because Bill and I watch all of these together, And I've read a lot more Christie than he had before we started this project. He started the annotations, but I had read more widely. And sometimes I would have to tell him what they were supposed to be doing because I knew the story and he didn't. And if you have to tell someone what is supposed to be happening, because the film doesn't make it clear, I think that that's a problem. So this was not one of my favorites. It was fine. It was one of the middle of the road ones.
Gotcha.
All right. Not my favorite.
Yeah. The way especially that.
Love the seance with Miss Lemon. Love the seance with Miss Lemon.
I love the seance with Miss Lemon is just such a great way, I think, of injecting some of that lightness, not at the expense of the plot. It's fantastic. And yeah, the way that Catherine and I tended to rewatch these was immediately after reading the novel. So that issue may have gone unremarked. So that's really interesting. All right. What is your least favorite of the David Suchets?
Appointment with Death. What a piece of crap. David Suchet tried really hard, but he was saddled with an atrocious script, absolutely atrocious. Slave trading nuns. And they made the film very short, only 80 minutes. And so there were huge sections of the plot that went absolutely nowhere. They so rewrote Mrs. Boynton that I really thought that the Ustinov Appointment with Death was going to be the worst version that I saw. I was really looking forward to David Suchet's version, and Peter Ustinov was better.
Wow.
And in fact, let me make a plug now for Monse Numura. He did An Appointment with Death, a Japanese one. If you can find it with the subtitles, it is superb. It is absolutely superb. It is the way Appointment with Death should have been made. It is intensely Japanese. It shows how universal Agatha is when you see how Mrs. Boynton, how she tortures them every step of the way psychologically. It is absolutely dead on, despite being intensely Japanese.
Oh, that's great. Well, yeah, and good to know that there is a good adaptation of Appointment with Death out there. It's just not an English language one, apparently.
There are 4, actually, because believe it or not, season 2 of Les Petites Muertes, one of their almost next to the last episodes, they also did Appointment with Death, and they also did a better job than either Peter Ustinov or David Suchet. I have no idea why, but that's the way it works.
Well, this won't be the last time on this episode that we'll be talking about the insertion of nuns into a plot, by the way. So more to come on that front. So my least favorite is undoubtedly The Labors of Hercules, which is the second to last episode ever to be aired. So rather than adapting each of Agatha Christie's Labors of Hercules,
which was a mistake,
which was a huge mistake because those
huge mistake that would have made a wonderful season by itself.
Exquisite short stories. Each of them could have been a separate episode. And here's the ironic thing. And I learned this from Mark Aldridge, as I learned so many things. One of the starting concepts of the series, when the producers of the Suchet series were thinking about what they wanted to do and how they wanted to start bringing Poirot stories to life, because they did not start out saying, we are going to adapt every single Poirot story out there. They had various sort of establishing concepts that they toyed around with. One of them was, why don't we do this Europe/globe-trotting lavish version of The Labors of Hercules, where we bring each of these individually to life and they'll kind of hang together and it'll just make this cohesive season/series of a show. That obviously is not what they ended up doing. And, they still had a wonderful first season where they were pulling stories from lots of different places. And it's actually fascinating to go through how and why they chose the short stories that they did, especially in those early seasons. But it's so ironic then that by the time they got to the last batch of episodes, they were like, oh no, we got to deal with The Labors of Hercules. And you could tell that they made fast work of it. I mean, this is a pastiche of an episode. It throws in elements of some of The Labors of Hercules more than others. And it's just a major departure from what Christie was doing in the text. It's a bit of a mess to me. Tonally, it's bloody. It has that kind of dark, dour Poirot tone that a lot of these later episodes have, and yet we don't have a brilliant text of Christie's, one of her brilliant novels, to rely on, and I think to carry us through that darker tone. It's just overstuffed, over serious, and I'm not a fan of it. And I think that's not that surprising of an opinion. I know there are a lot of people that do not cherish that episode in particular.
How can you not like a movie that ends in a Mexican standoff like the bar scene in Deadpool? Actually, I thought they did a surprisingly good job of working the stories together. I would have vastly preferred an individual season with each story given its own episode, like you said. I really would have preferred that. But considering what they had to work with, trying to cram them all into one giant film, kind of like The Big Four, was much better than I was dreading. And this I had no idea when I was sitting down. But as a movie on its own, it worked for me. It really did. And centering the story around I'm going to say the name wrong because it's that one of those strange Greek words, the Aramethian boar. I'm probably saying that word wrong. But I think that really worked. And they had all kinds of little shout outs to the various stories, most of which you just get an Easter egg on the screen. But it really did work for me. And I loved Alice's pug, Binky, because he's the dog that doesn't bark in the night. And he provides a critical clue to Poirot because he is the dog that doesn't bark in the night. So you even get a little bit of Sherlock Holmes in there.
Well, and Christie loved referencing that short story. Actually, that's not the only time she did that. I was actually annoyed by the fact that the Aramenthian boar was the anchoring story because that's one of my least favorite within the collection. I actually did not like how they chose that one and then they wove little elements. The Stymphalian birds is probably my favorite out of the collection. And there's a very slight element of the Stymphalian birds in there and of pretty much all the others. I mean, it's true. They really do shoehorn all them in, but to me, it feels like shoehorning.
It was shoehorning, but considering that they were trying to put 12 stories into one, they did a surprisingly good job. And I did like it, but especially, that Mexican standoff at the end, all I could think was, hey, you're in the bar at Deadpool's in the Deadpool movie, when our villains walk into the bar and whip out guns and discover that everyone else in the bar is armed and dangerous. And so you just kind of have to put all of your hardware away because you're not in charge. Someone else is in charge. There was a lot to like about that one, and I did like that. I like that better. I like that better than I like Peril at End House.
It kind of annoys me.
It's its own things. It is not faithful to the text. And one of the things I had to do when we were doing the Agatha project, that of course we're still doing now, is you have to rate your movies two ways. You have to rate them for faithful to text as well as quality of movie on its own, because there are movies that there are some of the films, they had very little to do with the text, but they still worked as movies. And there were other ones that were incredibly faithful to the text, but they didn't work as movies. They became stodgy and boring. And it is definitely a balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that kind of irks me is that the actor who's playing Vera Rosikoff, Countess Rosikoff, is different from the one who plays her in The Double Clue. So
I know.
It's a rare continuity, not error, but just, let's say a continuity misstep where, and Kika Markham, I think, is the one who plays her in The Double Clue. And I love that episode. And this just felt like a paltry echo.
Oh, yes.
Love affair.
It seems to me that if you are known if you were working hard towards accuracy, do try to get the same actress or actor for a particular part if they're repeating a role later on. The audience does notice.
Yeah, and they often, and you can really feel in the Suchet series that they were paying attention. I mean, they were paying attention most of the time and to all of the important things. Similar, I think, to Hickson, which is why, for a lot of people, David Suchet is the gold standard Poirot.
He'll always be the gold standard. Overall, they did a fabulous job. I read his memoirs. I don't know if you've read his memoirs about filming Poirot.
Oh, I've quoted them up and down the podcast. Poirot and Me. Are you kidding? I've probably read out the entire memoir over the course of 200 episodes.
and he worked so hard to become Poirot. They chose exactly the right actor. If they would have chosen a different actor, I don't know that the series would have run as long as it did.
I totally agree.
Hearing that story from the very beginning, when he refused on his very first day at his very first episode filming, Poirot would not wear that brown leisure suit. I would not wear that. And he was taking a risk. He was just a hired hand. He didn't become Poirot. It took time, but he was right. And if you've ever seen the 2001 Alfred Molina Murder on the Orient Express, which definitely has some real charms about it, He looks like a down market Columbo. And it matters how Poirot presents himself to the world. And David Suchet knew that.
Indeed. He brought a lot of discipline to his portrayal, and it shows for sure. Okay, let's talk about Geraldine McEwen next. So she was the first Miss Marple in ITV's Agatha Christie's Marple, which ran from 2004 to 2013. McEwen's episodes ran from 2004 to 2009. There are 12 of them because there were 4 episodes a season/series, and she had a 3-season/series run out of the 6 seasons total in that program. And this is a series that I think Catherine and I have criticized a lot over the course of this podcast. And I still think that there's a lot to criticize, but it's been instructive listening to some fans of the show who have contacted us and said, there are certain things that they were doing with this show, even in terms of their weird color saturation and the sometimes loopy kind of a tone that people really appreciated, and bringing more of a hijinksy kind of a spirit into these Miss Marple or, non-Miss Marple, Maid Marple stories really worked for a lot of people. So I never want to be dismissive of Agatha Christie's Marple, even though, to be clear, it is not my favorite. It is definitely not my favorite when it comes to adaptations of Christie. So I'm actually going to start because, funnily enough, Teresa, my favorite of the Geraldine McEwens is the same novel as your favorite of the Joan Hicksons. And again, even though it's not the first Miss Marple novel, it was the first adaptation to start off this new iteration of Miss Marple, and that is The Body in the Library. I think there's a reason why The Body in the Library was the first for both of these, because it's just, there's a simplicity to the mystery, but I think a clarity as to who Miss Marple is in this story that just makes it really accessible. And I enjoyed this adaptation in no small part due to the presence of Joanna Lumley, because I love Absolutely Fabulous.
Oh, she's fun. Very
and
fun.
And she's super fun as Dolly Bantry. And I think that for me, the Geraldine McEwen adaptations start to go off the rails. I can't exactly pinpoint where, but they certainly have not gone off the rails yet by the first episode. So with this very first one, I think you can feel all of the good intentions that were being brought to these adaptations of Miss Marple. So I'm going to go with The Body in the Library.
And I would not choose that one at all, because they changed the murderer around completely, which I did not like, especially because it came from totally out of left field, absolutely out of left field. I just couldn't do it. I just absolutely couldn't do it. The thing that's, I think you really have to give ITV credit for is they took risks. They took serious risks, and sometimes they crashed and burned, but other times they did absolutely superb films, really wonderful films. The Blue Geranium and Greenshaw's Folly showed what they could have done with all of the Miss Marple short stories, which have never,
Agreed.
Other than those, basically they've never been filmed.
Mm-hmm.
But no, the body in the Library, there was a huge amount to like, but the last 15 minutes it crashed and burned. It just didn't work as well for me. The ending is what killed it.
Okay, what's your favorite?
It's kind of a toss-up between The Moving Finger, which is, of course, an actual Miss Marple, and Ordeal by Innocence, which is not a Miss Marple story at all, but I thought it was wonderful. And again, she integrated seamlessly into Ordeal by Innocence, and in similar way to how she integrated with A Pocket Full of Rye, which is that Miss Marple, she has one of her the constant stream of young girls that she teaches how to be maids. And so she has Gwenda, and she teaches Gwenda how to be a maid and how to be more than a housemaid. And Gwenda manages to go off to become a private secretary and ends up as Leo Argyle's secretary. And when she is going to be married to Leo, and I have seen numerous adaptations of this novel, and Leo is as much like a louse as possible. He is never lion-like. And she has this wonderful future, this beautiful scene, and she calls Miss Marple to come to her wedding, the only family she has, and then everything turns to ashes in her mouth. And it is almost Shakespearean. It is just exquisite.
Miss Marple. Gwenda. Oh, how lovely to see you again.
Yes. Well, first of all, I must apologise for the weather. And I also must apologise, thank you, for the final mode of transport needed to get you over to Sunny Point. But you see, the house is on a little island.
Oh!
And yes, the only way of getting across is on one of the little boats, which are all named after Leo's children, actually.
Oh.
The boats.
Yes, well, slow down. Let me have a look at you. You look wonderful. It's been too long.
I'm so glad that you could come, Miss Marple. I can't tell you. You see, Leo has 5 grown-up children.
Oh, 5?
Yes, and you know how intimidating large families can be, especially when they're all holed up together.
Oh.
But at least I'm going to know I've got one person on my side this weekend.
It is absolutely exquisite. Love Ordeal by Innocence with Geraldine. Love the moving finger. And when Geraldine portrays Miss Marple, I think she does it kind of in a way like Joan Hickson, the older lady, instead of the brisk, tweedy Julia Mackenzie, but she has a little touch of battiness, the little touch of Margaret Rutherford battiness when she is on stage.
There's an extra twinkle for sure.
Yes, exactly.
No, that's interesting. I remember when we covered Ordeal by Innocence, and we would always go through all of the English language adaptations, no matter where they were coming from. And I was surprised because I had watched the Donald Sutherland Ordeal by Innocence when I was a child, and my memory of it did not match my rewatch. And I think there's something to be said for the Geraldine McEwen in some ways over that one, which is, dare I even say that, but it's
much better.
And I remember being really surprised by that. I wouldn't say it's better necessarily, but I think that there are certainly aspects of it that are much better than the Donald Sutherland version, which has a lot of issues, but is also a fascinating adaptation in its own right. The least of my problems with these adaptations is generally the way that they introduce Miss Marple into the non-Marple novels. Sometimes it's awkward. Ordeal by Innocence is one where it works really well, and I actually think it tends to work okay when they do it with other Miss Marple novels. It's just that it's so curious to me that they chose to do that before going to the well of all of those Miss Marple short stories, which they did start to do. And I agree with you. Those 2, it's like there are a whole bunch more. Why didn't you do more of those when you had the opportunity? I think they passed up a real opportunity there. But hey, so did the Joan Hickson series. They decided not to do many of those short stories.
Joan was getting up there. She was, I think, in her late 80s, and she was getting tired, and it showed. But Julia Mackenzie is where they started doing the short stories, and she was much younger, and she could have done. Julia Mackenzie falls into the Angela Lansbury, Jessica Fletcher, brisk and tweedy mode.
Mm-hmm.
But she could have done a lot of the short stories, and they would have been, based on the 2 that they did, they could have done a neat job. There was a whole lot of material.
I agree.
And it was a chance for the screenwriters to really flesh out a plot. So they really could have done wonderful things, but they didn't. And who knows why they do what they do.
Yeah, alas. And, maybe at some point someone will adapt those Miss Marple short stories. Some of them have been adapted for the Japanese animated
That's correct.
Series, for example. But let me talk about my least favorite of the Geraldine McEwens. And I said that I was going to talk about nuns being injected into a plot. So this is going to be Nemesis, actually, which was my favorite of the Joan Hicksons. And here it's not Clotilde Bradbury Scott, but Sister Clotilde, who is our villain. And I just think even beyond the fact that we're dealing with nuns here, and it gets almost like oddly critical of like organized religion in a way that's like not particularly intelligent or interesting toward the end of this episode. It's just, for me, it was bananas, the changes that were made. And not because they're changes, but just because I think it generally misses the mark in terms of what makes this novel so good. To me, it almost felt like a misread of Nemesis, because we get this fake out where it seems like the cast of suspects and whodunit is going to be taken from that bus, right? Miss Marple is on this trip, and there are all these people on this bus. Someone gets killed by a rolling rock. It's rather hard to believe. It's all a little bit incredible, but that's okay. But then it turns into something very different when she stops and she's staying at this house with these sisters, and the story kind of plays out from there. And it almost felt like when they are adapting this, they were like, we kind of want to more make this being more of like an and then there were none situation with everyone on the bus. I thought
exactly the same thing. Yes, it does have a distinctly and then there were none vibe. The first half of it really worked for me. And then again, this is where the ending is critical, the last 15 minutes, because it just fell apart completely. That plot went bananas, like you said. And it's like they didn't have the courage of their own convictions. If you're going to go bananas, go all out.
Yep.
And make sure you tie your bananas up or make your bananas into banana splits so that it works at the ending. The ending was just so awful. And then to have that denouement where Geraldine McEwen is cutting her finger on the rose and she's looking at her bleeding hand and you can just see what she's thinking. Did I make a mistake? I didn't sign on for another season, or did I make a mistake with the murderers? Or how many mistakes have I been making? And it just made no sense at all. The whole end, the last 15 minutes of that, oh my God. One piece of inanity after another. But that's not my worst film.
Well, before you get onto your worst, I controlled myself and I'm only going to be quoting from Mark Aldrich once on this episode. And I already quoted from him. I'm sure I did this exact quote when we were covering Nemesis, but he just so perfectly encapsulates, I think, what's wrong with this episode and a little bit of critique of the series overall. This is what he said, that this episode has the unfortunate distinction of being the lowest rated episode of the whole run, with fewer than 4.5 million viewers tuning in. It is once more a very loose adaptation with considerable changes to characters and motivation, and yet another example of this era of adaptation's bizarre fixation with villainous religious figures. This change is a further indication of the series as pastiche of a vague memory of Christie's mysteries that actually encompasses thrillers of the 1930s and 1940s, such as The Lady Vanishes, rather than anything in Christie's own work. And you do get that sense sometimes that this is building in homages to Christie adjacent sort of mysteries rather than actually engaging with the Christie text itself, than squarely engaging with it. And that when I feel that happening, I get annoyed. And I felt that with this one.
Yeah, sometimes they make choices that I really, truly don't understand, because you have so much plot there in the novel. Why don't you use the plot instead of coming up with something totally from left field?
What is your least favorite, Teresa?
The Sitterford mystery. Oh my God, what a travesty. That was a train wreck. You can cue up Sir Mix-a-Lot and recite along with me. Oh my God, look at that plot. I mean, it started from the very first scene when they hired Timothy Dalton to play Captain Trevelyan, who in the novel never even says one single word. He's murdered sometime during the first chapter. He never says one single word. And so you have to make up this entire huge, elaborate plot about Captain Trevelyan because you're paying Timothy Dalton to emote. And I like watching Timothy Dalton, but oh my God. And Geraldine as Miss Marple, you could tell that she did not want to be there because she spent long stretches of that film off stage, obviously knitting and speed reading his memoirs so that she knew what it was he claimed he was doing. It made absolutely no sense. So much of that film made zero sense whatsoever. It was the worst of the bunch.
It's a criminal underuse of Carey Mulligan also, by the way. It might be the worst thing Carey Mulligan's ever been in. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Oh, yes. She's playing Violet Willett, and then she runs off with Emily Trefusis to Argentina at the end.
Of course she does.
And of course she does. She does it. She got everything. She got everything. She married Captain Trevelyan and stayed married just long enough to inherit everything and not have to sacrifice herself to that old man, the very happy woman. And so she gets to run off to Argentina with someone else.
Yeah.
But what a travesty. That was just terrible.
I fully support that one. I mean, I did not like Nemesis, but I also did not like the Sitterford mystery adaptation either.
No, there were things I liked better about Nemesis from the beginning. I really loved that 1950s Mission Impossible opening, with you've got the record playing. Really liked that. That really worked.
Okay, well, let's move on to the Julia Mackenzie episodes of this same program of Agatha Christie's Marple. So these ran from 2009 to 2013. There are 12 of the Geraldine McEwens. There are 11 Julia Mackenzies. We had 4 a season once again for season 4 through 6, except that the last season/series only has 3 episodes. They, I guess, ran out of steam there. So what is your favorite, Teresa?
Oh, this was a hard one because I really liked The Pale Horse. I really liked The Blue Geranium. Caribbean Mystery was absolutely wonderful. Everything you could want, including James Bond, the ornithologist, and Voodoo. They were all superb. But I think in the end, the Blue Geranium says that ITV could have done all of the short stories and done wonders with them.
Yeah.
And they didn't. They only filmed 2 of the short stories. Rewriting the Blue Geranium says they could have done them all. They could have fleshed them out. They could have made them into the stories that they wanted to be, into full-length movies, because short stories are great for adapting for a movie because you can expand on it without having to remove huge chunks of plot. You can expand what you have, and it fits perfectly within a movie. They did some wonderful ones. Absolutely wonderful. Definitely those 3.
Yeah, it's funny. I would have to choose either of those 2 short story adaptations. I still have issues, I think, with just the general look and feel of these adaptations once Julia Mackenzie took over as well. And I guess if pushed, I probably actually prefer Julia Mackenzie to Geraldine McEwen, but it's a little bit of a toss-up because I think Joan Hickson truly inhabits who Miss Marple is, and neither of them do. But I found both of those episodes to be really exciting for that exact reason. Let's just bring these short stories to the screen. And Agatha Christie herself, I did a 4-hour plus episode recently on The Mousetrap, and she talks about how being able to adapt the radio play, the half-hour radio play, into a full-length stage play is one of the reasons that she thinks her stage play is as well structured as it is, and how it is always preferable to go from less to more when you're adapting. And it's one reason why I think the Suchet series, so many of those early episodes work as well. They definitely had to expand the story, and often they gave, especially Captain Hastings, like a sport of the episode that he gets obsessed with, or like a car or something like that, and you throw in a little car chase at the end, but they're able to retain the mystery and fully tease it out and not cut any corners with the telling of the mystery or the laying down of the puzzle. And that's often, if you can do that, you're like more than halfway there, when it comes to adapting one of these Christie stories. And you can see them doing that with Blue Geranium and also Greenshaw's Folly. And I believe that Greenshaw's Folly had an element of the Herb of Death in it as well. There was like a little bit of a mashup going on there, which I was fine with.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Yes, they did.
That's okay. So yeah, I would have to say those, but I do also have to give a little shout out to The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, only because I mentioned Joanna Lumley from The Body in the Library. And so she is the bridge between Geraldine McEwen and Julia Mackenzie. She reprises her role as Dolly Bantry. They did not pull a Countess Rosikoff like from the Suchet series. They got Joanna Lumley to come back and to be Dolly Bantry, so good on them for that. And that one also stars Lindsay Duncan as Marina Gregg, and I think she's quite good in the episode. The adaptation overall, it's not necessarily one of my favorites, but I thought she brought a lot to the role of Marina that worked. And Hugh Bonneville is the Inspector D'Soir in that episode, and I'm always happy to see Hugh Bonneville on my screen.
Well, thinking about The Mirror Cracked, that's one of my favorite novels. And it is a novel that, as I've gotten older, particularly after I've had children, I am now horrified at Marina Gregg, at her behavior. Absolutely horrified. And I've now seen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versions of The Mirror Cracked. And what is really fascinating about them, you watch the Angela Lansbury one because you want to see star power. Elizabeth Taylor, of all of the actresses I've seen play Marina Gregg, Elizabeth Taylor is the only one really you understand why a superfan will get out of her sickbed, break quarantine, slap on makeup, and go fangirl all over her idol. And you know that the story comes from Jean Tierney's tragedy.
Sure.
So the Angela Lansbury version, you see because of Elizabeth Taylor and Kim Novak and Tony Curtis and Rock Hudson. But what's interesting about that, really interesting about that, is the character of Margot Bence. And Margot is a critical person in the plot. She is one of the 3 children who was adopted by Marina Gregg and then discarded. And Margot resents it tremendously. And even though the actress playing Margot Bence is actually given a credit on Internet Movie Database, you never see her. She never comes on stage. She never speaks. When you see the Joan Hickson version, I don't think the Marina Gregg was particularly good because you're not seeing a movie star.
Mm-hmm.
And for that one, they set you up for Margot, and then it all went away, and Margot didn't get a chance to speak. Then you see the one with Julia McKenzie, and this Margot has a chance to speak. But again, they cut away from that critical speech that Margot says about Marina Gregg. She did the cruelest thing to us that you can do to another human being. She made us think she cared, that she loved us, and then she threw us away. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
Then I've seen the Japanese one. Margot and her siblings are actually allowed to speak. And in fact, you see Marina Gregg sobbing on the balcony as the children are being taken away from her. And you have to remind yourself, she arranged that. She arranged to have those children taken away. And she's using this to infuse her acting ability, this trauma, this tragedy. She's reveling in her grief. And even in the Japanese one, which gives Margot and her sibs an opportunity to speak, they still aren't allowed to say, "We hate you for what you did to us." It's only the French version, Les Petites Muertes, season 2, where Margot actually gets a chance to confront Marina Gregg and says, "How could you do this to me?" The Julia McKenzie is probably, other than Margot Bentz, is probably puts most of the book onto the film, but they keep pulling back at that scene. And I think it's because an awful lot of Hollywood types, they can't bring themselves to say what Marina Gregg did was wrong.
Interesting. What is your least favorite among
The Secret of Chimneys. Oh, that was terrible. What a terrible film that was. It didn't make any sense. We rewatched it last night so I could remind myself, because one of the other things I've learned about doing this project is you really end up having to watch a movie twice.
Mm-hmm.
The first time is to just get a feel for it, and the second time is to figure out what's going on.
Right.
And it was worse. I mean, the entire subplot with Anthony Cade coming out of Africa. Why did his criminal mastermind in Pretoria say, if you want to save your best friend, you have to find this diamond that was stolen 23 years ago, and you have 6 weeks in which to do it? That diamond is gone. That made absolutely no sense whatsoever. How Treadwell was handled, how Lord Caterham was handled. I didn't like the way they treated Bundle. Everyone dismissed her from start to finish.
That adaptation is an utter mess.
It was a mess.
With that.
Absolutely a mess. The house was really nice.
Right.
The house was really nice. Miss Marple pulled her solution out of her knitting bag. And just like she pulled that diamond out of the water. And I don't think when you poison people with foxglove, you give them the runs. I don't think it works. I would have to look it up, but I don't think foxglove works that way. I think foxglove gives everyone heart palpitations.
It is. I actually know this for sure. It works on the heart. Yes.
So you didn't care for it either?
No, I definitely did not. I mean, I think, The Secret of Chimneys is not one of my favorite novels, as we've discussed. We're coming full circle here. I love that we're sort of ending on The Secret of Chimneys for you, but that is definitely not one of my favorite of these. I have, for me, a pretty easy least favorite, and it's not The Secret of Chimneys. It is Murder is Easy, which is something that I was reflecting on since we had this new adaptation of Murder is Easy that came out this past Christmas in the UK. It is now officially available in the US as well. And it's on our list to watch.
Okay.
Oh, I won't talk about the new adaptation. So this Agatha Christie's Marple adaptation, I think, is notorious for adding incest.
It wasn't Lydia your brother forced himself on that night, was it? It wasn't Lydia who cried and begged him to stop.
He was drunk. He was too strong. It hurt. If I'd reported it, they would have put him away. But if I didn't, I was afraid he would defile me again. So next afternoon, I let him go and play and followed him. And pushed him off.
And secret babies. Let us not forget secret babies, one of the great tropes of Romance-landia.
But you couldn't have helped Amy in any case, could you? Because all those years ago, your own maternal instinct was too strong and you changed your mind.
I poured the horrid stuff down the drain.
and shut yourself away like a hermit until your time came.
I gave birth.
Yeah, there are just times where it feels like, and Mark has talked about this, Mark Aldrich, there's something almost juvenile in the way that sometimes in these ITV, Agatha Christie's Marple adaptations, there are certain elements added for shock value. And that's what it feels like. It feels like a sort of like, oh, well, let's just add incest because that's just shocking. And it's not, it's unnecessary. And I don't think you can really make a good defense for it. And I feel really bad for Shirley Henderson, who's the actor who plays Honoria Wainfleet, because I think she does a good job, actually. Like, she's an actor whose work I enjoy. And, you know, she does what she can with the material, but that denouement is just horrifying and not in a good way. I mean, to me, it just kind of upends everything that came before it. And, you know, despite the presence of Benedict Cumberbatch,
he was wasted. He was absolutely wasted. He could have been removed totally, and basically all of his part given to Police Constable Reed, who is being taught by the mistress of leading questions. You know, he could have been removed completely, especially because of all of his scenes with Bridget Conway. Everything that was in the novel between him and Bridget Conway, oh my God, how her character was rewritten. Oh my God. You know, why is she carrying a postcard of the Empire State Building around with her in her handbag so that she can reenact an affair to remember, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I think that Luke Fitzwilliam is pretty useless even in the text. So Benedict Cumberbatch is equally useless in this adaptation. But why cast Benedict Cumberbatch if you're going to just keep him useless and not actually use him?
At the time, he was just another up-and-coming character actor.
No, but he's good. He's a good actor. You know, that's what I mean.
But he wasn't the star that he became. And that's why it's, you know, when you go back in time and watch something like this, it's really weird to see, you know, Sherlock Holmes being put in his place by Miss Marple. It's just really weird. But if you watched it at the time, you wouldn't have had, I think, as much of a sensation of this is wrong. There was so much that was wrong with that movie. They removed so much of the plot, and then they rewrote it wholesale. I don't know why they did what they did. Chimneys was still worse, and I have to say that Endless Night was worse too. That was really schizophrenic. You had two movies crammed together. When Miss Marple was off stage in Endless Night, the film worked, and when Miss Marple came on stage, it stopped working.
Well, what I wanted to get out of this exercise was sort of being able to celebrate and excoriate each one of these different iterations of screen adaptations. Because I think, and we talked about this a little bit off mic, I think that I'm never angry at the existence of any adaptation, no matter, even if I think it's a terrible one, because it's interesting to talk about why. And I love the fact that we have as many adaptations of Agatha Christie content as we do, because I think it also gives people the freedom to do interesting things with it at this point. There's such an embarrassment of riches, you know, that it's let's just go crazy. And I love that.
There's, I think, also a more important reason. And it is that every time you do an adaptation of Agatha Christie, wherever you are, anywhere in the world, you are putting her in front of an audience that has never heard of her before. You do not know. I've actually met through Instagram. And hey, folks, you can follow me on Instagram at Peschel Press. I actually met someone through Instagram. The first Agatha Christie adaptation he had ever seen was Alfred Molina's Murder on the Orient Express, the CBS movie from 2001. He didn't know who Agatha Christie was. And there are so many people who have no idea who an individual author is. And for every person who reads, I think you can safely assume at least 100 people go to the movies and at least 1,000 people watch TV. And when you look at the tsunami of books being published every day, it's so easy to vanish. It is so easy to vanish. And the adaptations, whatever you can say about the quality of them or how true they are to the text, if they make someone pick up a book by Agatha Christie, they've succeeded. And the best way to explain what happens is, I assume, of course, that you are familiar with Dorothy Sayers.
Of course.
Okay, and you're familiar with Downton Abbey.
Of course.
Ask yourself why the Sayers estate did not license Lord Peter say the phrase "murder at Downton Abbey." They could have licensed Lord Peter the Duke's brother to solve mysteries. You refilm what they have. I mean, they haven't filmed a Lord Peter since 1980. You're the expert on this, Bill. 1985? Around 1985. And her estate is owned by a literary agency along with dozens of other dead authors. And as far as we can tell, they do nothing with her. And so Dorothy Sayers is being lost. But Agatha Christie, because of the films and TV shows, is not.
Yeah, it's unique to her, but I think there are a lot of people out there who don't like the fact that many people know Christie through her adaptations, or that's how they first come to her. But I completely agree with you. I think that it's part of the power of Christie. And not everyone who watches a Christie adaptation or multiple Christie adaptations is going to pick up one of the books, but many of them will. And
many of them will. It is advertising. And you've probably had this experience as part of the Christie, as part of the Agatha Project. Of course, we're watching everything. And so I'm down there at the library and I'm holding up N or M, the David Walliams disaster. And the librarian is telling me, oh, I loved that. And all I can think is, really? But, it could have been so much better. It could have been so much better. But she didn't know who Tommy and Tuppence were. She didn't know who N or M were. And maybe she'll pick up the book.
Totally. Well, I'm curious, Teresa, I kind of ask people on this podcast, what is your Agatha Christie origin story? How did you first become a Christie fan? Was it through adaptations or was it through the books? How did it work?
It was through the books. I've always read the books, but I wasn't an obsessive fan. We had Agatha Christie at home. If they were around, I read them, but I wasn't an obsessive fan. And then Bill started doing the annotations, starting with The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I started reading the books because I needed to edit him. I had to make sure all of his footnotes and essays were correct. And in order to do that, I had to read the books. Then after he had done the books, because we were up to Secret of Chimneys by that time when we started the Agatha Project, watching all of the films. And in order to really have a good idea of how well the film adapts the book, I had to read everything as we went along. And so I've read now virtually everything except Passenger to Frankfurt and Destination Unknown or So Many Steps to Death. It's not Destination Baghdad or
They Came to Baghdad.
They Came to Baghdad. I've read that now because and thank you for telling us about that Studio One presentation appearing on YouTube because we snagged it and watched it. Once we started doing the films, having to read everything, I discovered a lot of Christie I had no idea existed. And I was fascinated with The Hollow. She was really transforming what the genre can do. People who dismiss her as a cozy writer have absolutely no idea what she writes. There is nothing cozy about And Then There Were None or Appointment with Death. I thought that There Is a Tide was amazing, and it was so specifically tied to a specific time period in England. And the Suchet version was really not very good. But interestingly, the French Little Murders, this was season 1, did a remarkably good job with There Is a Tide. And
which is Taken at the Flood, just for anyone who might not recognize the American title of Taken at the Flood.
And then the 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, which I had never read. And that turned out really quite well with the David Suchets, moving it forward before World War II, with the Oswald Mosley's brown shirts. It just worked perfectly. And when you read Christie more widely, you realize she is underrated. She's really good, and she makes it look easy. Her books are extremely accessible. They're extremely popular. They're genre mysteries, and yet there is more if you want to see it.
Music to my ears, Teresa. I'm just sitting here beaming. I couldn't agree more with everything that you're saying. I'm curious, do you have a favorite Christie novel?
Appointment with Death, which was, I guess, one of the reasons why I was so disappointed with the 2 English language versions. I really don't, because there's so many of them that are so good.
Mm-hmm.
And the callbacks, Endless Night is amazing. And Endless Night is one of those books you can only read once, because the second time around, you are reading a really different book.
Yeah, well, you can still appreciate, the voice and other things. But yes, it's a different experience anyway.
Same thing with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. You can only read it once, because the second time around, it's really different.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read everything, you see the connections between, say, Death on the Nile and Endless Night.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
They're very closely connected,
Yes.
even though they seem wildly different. But at their core, it is a hidden couple and a woman who's murdered. And she turns the trope on its head. And in Death on the Nile, Simon never regrets murdering Lynette. But Mike Rogers really regrets murdering Ellie. He really regrets it.
Well, and you can add the mysterious affair at Styles to that as well, actually.
Oh, yes, absolutely. You have that hidden couple. There's just so much to discover and to rediscover.
Yeah, absolutely. There is one question that I ask everyone, or almost everyone, who comes on this podcast, and you have to answer either or. Gun to your head, Poirot or Marple?
Oh, you're so cruel. You're so cruel. Miss Marple.
Yes. And why?
I like the way she thinks she is, she has a mind like a bacon slicer. And she is an old woman who is discounted. And yet she sees everything around her and she sees it so clearly. And she ends up not being discounted at all. Poirot is a famous private detective, maybe not the most famous private detective or the finest private detective in the world, as he says, but you can make a darn good case for that being true. But Miss Marple is an old woman, a spinster from some little village that nobody ever heard of, and yet she shows that she matters. That old lady in the corner that you are ignoring has a great deal to offer.
Once again, I'm just sitting here beaming. I am a Marpleite, so I am thrilled that you gave the right answer and that you answered Marple. Teresa, you are going to actually be appearing at the Agatha Christie Festival in the panel that I'm hosting, where we're going to try to figure out what Agatha Christie's greatest screen adaptation is. Based off of this conversation, I cannot wait for you to be a part of that, because you have a lot of opinions and you are extremely articulate and eloquent about them. I think we're going to have such a good time figuring out what Agatha Christie's greatest screen adaptation is. I would just love to give you the opportunity to tell everyone who is listening to this episode what you're working on, what you have coming up, and how people can find you and your material.
Well, obviously, we've finished Agatha Christie, She Watched, and that led into international Agatha Christie. And we are watching all of the international adaptations that we can find with English subtitles. And if you visit our website, www.peschel.press, I spell P as in Papa, E as in Echo, S as in Sierra, C as in Charlie, H as in Hotel, E as in Echo, L as in Lima, press.com. We have a list of all of the Agatha Christie international adaptations that we are watching. I post the reviews every week. And if you have access to one of the films that we are looking for, one of the international ones with English subtitles, we would be really grateful. And we'll make arrangements, email us, and as a reward, you'll be in the acknowledgments to the book, to International Agatha Christie when we publish it, and we will send you a trade paperback. So you will be rewarded if you can help us find that scarce Japanese version of 450 from Paddington. So we are working on that. We hope to have it finished by August. We are including the films that didn't make it into Agatha Christie She Watched. So that will be Murder is Easy, which just came out in the United States a day or two ago. And of course, A Haunting in Venice, which was much better than I feared. And They Came to Baghdad, the Studio One episode from 1952. When we are finished with international, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to do a different film project where, once again, I'm going to be the only person who has ever done this. We are going to watch, review, and put together as a book all of the films of Jane Austen.
Ooh.
There's about 80 of them if we include the documentaries, and there's an enormous array of Jane Austen films. We will do everything, and that should be a really fun project. No murder. It'll be a nice change from murder. We'll get back to murder. We'll get back to murder at the movies when we're done with Jane Austen, and that's when you'll see us do all of the Lord Peter Wimsey films, among others.
Well, and Jane Austen has come up once or twice on the podcast. Believe it or not, there's a little bit of crossover, I think, between Agatha Christie and Jane Austen. And certainly there's a lot of crossover in terms of people who enjoy both of those authors' work. And I include myself as one of them. So I cannot wait to read that book. I am also going to include a link to your website in the notes to this episode. So in case you didn't get the URL as Teresa was spelling it out, you can also just click on the link in the notes, and that'll be an easy way to get onto her website and to find out more about Peschel Press and everything that they have going on. And you mentioned that you are on Instagram.
We are on Instagram. It is Peschel_press. And by now, if you type in our first name, we're probably the first people to pop at the top if you type in Peschel. All of the links are on the website. We also have a Facebook account, and we've done our own podcast where we discuss the films of Agatha Christie, and the links again are in our website. The other project that we're working on that you might be interested in is Bill is annotating all of the Dorothy Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey novels, short stories, and we'll finish up with Montague Egg. He's a huge Dorothy Sayers fan, and she really needs annotating because you're probably not up on your ancient Greek nearly as well as you should be.
Right.
You slacker, you. And they will be available in the United States until she comes into the public domain worldwide in January of 2028.
And will you be doing more annotated versions of future Agatha Christie novels as they become available in the US, as they fall out of copyright in the United States? Is that on the roster?
That's a hard one to answer because right now Dorothy is taking our time because she comes into the public domain, which means we can sell her worldwide, whereas Agatha is only available in the US. And we have to put it's hundreds and you've seen our annotated Christmas now, and it is hundreds and hundreds of hours of work. And the idea is that we would actually like to sell some copies to make some money. This is a business. This is a business decision. This is a business decision. So I would like to, but at the same time, I don't know that we can. I think about Partners in Crime, and what I would do if we were doing Partners in Crime is you print the short story, and then you take a representative story of the author she was parodying, because almost without exception, every one of them who was a huge name in 1923, and today they are forgotten.
Except for G.K. Chesterton, because of the Father Brown series. That's about it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I didn't realize this until we started watching, all of the Agathas, and we're watching Partners in Crime, and I'm having to research each of the episodes to find out why they were so wildly varied in how she wrote them, what kind of a story she was telling. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And I think when you read the short stories today, if you don't have the author that she was referring to, you really, again, you don't get the full experience. If you don't know that she's parodying Baroness Orcasey with the old man in the corner, you don't have any idea why Tommy is doing what he's doing.
Oh, absolutely. When Catherine and I covered those, we gave a little précis about who each of these authors was. And it was really necessary to do that. And we had to bone up on each of the authors because we pretty much had no idea. And it was really interesting to see what she was doing. She does, of course, parody herself as well. So that might be the most recognizable one. But just fascinating that so many of these authors are lost to the sands of time, but not Christie.
Not Christie. And part of it is the constant stream of public adaptations, which keeps her in the public eye. And, the estate, it matters to the estate. It matters to Matthew Pritchard and James Pritchard. It really matters. And so this is what they're doing. They're making sure that she does not vanish under the tsunami of swill, which comes out every single day. Every single day. I think 10,000 books are published, especially when you include indies like us. And we don't consider ourselves as part of the tsunami of swill. I just want to get that out there. Yeah. But there's so much being published. You go to any library, you go to any bookstore, and it is stacked to the ceiling with books by people who have been forgotten.
Yeah.
And she won't be.
Well, I think that sentiment is probably a good place to end. Thank you for how much time you took today to sit down and engage in my little ranking exercise. And
it's been great fun.
I was not in doubt that it would be super, super fun. So thank you to you. Thank you to Bill, who I know has been standing just off mic this whole time. And I can't wait to meet both of you in person in England.
This has been absolutely a delight to talk to you, Kemper. I am so pleased that you invited me onto the podcast. I really appreciate it. it. And I can't wait to meet you in person in Torquay.
In Turkey. All right. Thank you, Teresa.
You're welcome.
Thank you again to Teresa Peschel and to Bill Peschel. That was a really fabulous conversation. And as I said to Teresa, I can't wait to continue that conversation in Torquay when Teresa and I and Victoria and Mark and John crown Agatha Christie's greatest screen adaptation. That's going to be a lot of fun. I think it's going to be a spirited debate. As I already mentioned, you can click on the link that I've provided for the Agatha Christie Festival. You can also click on the link I provided for the Peschel Press website. For my next episode, I will be covering an original short story by Agatha Christie. We still have a few of those. This one is called The Actress, or Trap for the Unwary. So if you haven't read that one yet, you might want to check it out. It's one of the stories that appears in the While the Light Lasts collection. That's probably the easiest way for you to find it. In that collection, it's under the title The Actress. So that will be next time. You can check out the podcast's Patreon page. I've included a link in the show notes. I just covered an episode of the old UK program Crown Court. This was an episode called Evil Liver, written by Niall Marsh and starring Joan Hickson. It was so much fun to watch and to discuss with all the patrons over there. That is March's episode. And then for April, I am going to be reading my second full-length Niall Marsh novel ever. I'm dipping my toes in the marsh, listeners, with Overture to Death. I'm very excited. So that's what's going on at the moment over on Patreon. If you have strong opinions about the best and worst adaptations of any of the programs that Teresa and I were discussing, I would love to hear from you. Email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Or you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. Buy my debut novel, The Busybody. Links provided in the show notes. I am always on the hunt for more ratings and reviews. I've gotten a couple of those trickling in. We are still just under 1,000, so I am still looking to push the podcast past that 1,000 rating milestone on Apple Podcasts. Just throwing that out there. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.
Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pear Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out Pear.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.